Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're talking about narcissistic mothers. We're joined by Dr. Stephanie Kriesberg, author of Adult Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers. She has practiced clinical psychology for 25 years. A graduate of the Ferkauf Graduate School of Psychology of Yeshiva University, she is trained in psychodynamic, psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. In addition, she is trained in the practice of clinical hypnosis. Kriesberg is on the board of the New England Society of Clinical Hypnosis. Hi, Stephanie. Thanks so much for joining us on Evidence Based today.
Well, thank you, Cassie. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
I think we're talking about such an important topic, so I want to get started with kind of a basic question of what is narcissism, and specifically, how does it show up in mothers?
Okay. So, I think of narcissism as a personality style. Okay. And we've heard a lot about it over the past few years. I just want to say right off the bat, I like to add that this is not, a topic. This is not a book that's about mother bashing. We have enough of this in the world. This is really about understanding. It's about helping daughters understand what they grew up with so they can understand themselves better. So narcissism is a personality style, and it is really characterized by some major characteristics. So people who are too full of themselves, this is what we see on the outside. We see people who are too full of themselves, with an inflated sense of self-importance, who seem entitled, think they're special and deserve special treatment. This is the person who needs a lot of admiration and attention. Everything revolves around them, okay? So this might be, let's say a mother who, you come home at the end of the day, maybe growing up, the daughter wants to tell her about her day, but mom is too busy talking about herself. It's also characterized by a real lack of empathy, not being able to understand somebody else's feelings. And on top of that, people who have this personality style have no self-awareness, no insight. So they're just sort of oblivious. They don't realize that they're so self-involved and that they have no empathy for other people's feelings. That's one style of narcissism. It's not just the sort of one size fits all thing. That is what we call the grandiose narcissist. And, we all kind of can picture someone like that, either someone we know or, the obnoxious celebrity. But there's another style that often people tell me, oh, I didn't even know that was narcissism. And that is what we call vulnerable or covert narcissism. It's very quiet. This person struggles with the same things inside, maybe feeling that they're special, that they should get special treatment, but they also have this dose of depression and anxiety. They're introverted. And so their narcissism shows up in needing everybody to take care of them, very dependent and needy. So this might be the mother who expects her daughter to, maybe growing up, not to do any activities because she's got to come right home after school and take care of everything around the house. And she also doesn't have any empathy for her daughter's feelings, any insight. Inside both of these types of narcissists, of mothers, really struggle on the inside with real insecurity. And you might not ever see that on the outside, but that's what's happening. That's what makes them run.
It was so interesting reading your book and reading about the vulnerable narcissist because, like you said, that's maybe the lesser known type. Do you find that one's harder for people to recognize in their mothers when they're, working through all of this?
It really is, because this person, when we think of a narcissist, we just think of someone who's just so full of themselves, loud, obnoxious. And really, narcissism, can show up in these quieter, more subtle ways. And, I've had people, come in or read the book and say, I didn't know. I didn't know that could be narcissism. And it is. It's much harder we just don't know that is a facet of narcissism.
And just while we're talking about what a narcissist is, can you talk a little bit about the converse, like what a healthy sense of identity looks like, just as, to contrast with the narcissistic mother?
Sure. And I think that's a really good point. So people who are healthy, and of course, we all, have issues, right? Nobody is perfect. I'm not talking about some ideal person,
Of course.
but we know that people, we tend to think one, people who are healthy have just a healthy sense of who, as an adult, who they are. They have a sense of direction in life. They know what their values are and what's important to them. They can identify their emotions, know what they're feeling, and do what we call in psychology, do emotional regulation. They can handle their emotions. If they feel upset about something, they're not going to just constantly fly off the handle. Or if they're sad, they're not going to do self-harm. They're going to find some ways to handle it in a healthy way. They can be in healthy relationships with other people. They can have close friendships or a partner if they choose to. And they can be, and I think you had a whole podcast about that. They can be psychologically flexible. They can be in the present moment. They can adapt to what's going on in life. And, these are sort of the hallmarks of being able to be, a psychologically mature, functioning person. And the final sort of, if you look at it as like a quadrant, is empathy. Being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, understand what they're feeling. It doesn't mean you necessarily agree with it, and you can validate that person's feelings. Because if you can't do that, you really can't have a relationship with somebody.
Those are really good points. And as we're talking about the adult daughter of a narcissistic mother, what are some common struggles or challenges she may deal with in her adulthood?
Okay. Well, first, maybe let's think about what she experiences growing up, because that really lays the groundwork or the ground for her struggles in adulthood. So, the women that I work with, what they struggle with growing up with when a mom is really has no sense of herself, she's empty inside, she looks to her daughter to fill her up, to make her feel like a worthwhile, valuable person. She doesn't know that. She's not aware of that she's basically using her daughter to kind of self-regulate her sense of self. So that is not a good plan. That doesn't work out well. So she doesn't have good self-esteem inside. So then her child comes along and her child becomes a way to feel good about herself. But children can't do that for us. They need us to accept them for who they are. That means if the child doesn't live up to who we are, and of course they don't always, the child feels criticized, not seen, invisible, not accepted. They might even feel that their parent treats them with contempt. That's a very, common feeling. They feel uncared for, unloved. The adult daughter then grows up feeling ashamed, feeling not good enough, constantly doubting herself, second guessing herself, because she kind of was constantly failing as a child because she couldn't meet her mother's needs. She couldn't fill up her mother. And of course she couldn't. It was an impossible task from the beginning. And one more thing that I would add is that a common behavior on the part of narcissistic mothers, really all narcissists, is something we call gaslighting.
I hear that term absolutely everywhere now, and I feel like there are some misconceptions of it. I wondered if you could talk about where the term came from, and now that it's in the popular culture, can you say more about what it is and what it isn't?
Sure. So gaslighting, again, like narcissism, it's one of those terms that gets thrown out around a lot, like, oh, he talks about himself so much, he's a narcissist. But, it's really like just narcissist is not a term to be tossed around lightly, and really nor is gaslighting. It's a real phenomenon. It's good that it's getting attention. I think that's helpful. So where it actually comes from, it's an interesting story. It's a movie that goes back to, I believe it's the 1930s, that was actually based on a play. And it's an old black and white movie. You can probably find it on YouTube, called Gaslight. And in it, a husband tries to drive his wife, crazy because he wants to get his hands on her money. And so he does all kinds of things to make her doubt herself and doubt her sense of reality. And one of the things he does, because it actually takes place, really around the turn of the 19th century, is he'll they had gas lights, he'll turn them off or flicker them. And then she'll say, oh, it's dark in here. And he'll say, it's not dark. What's wrong with you? And then he does these kinds of things throughout the movie. So little by little, she just gets kooky, and she's carted off to literally like dragged off to the, crazy house. But in the end, she prevails and he doesn't get her money, and that's good. But that's where the term gaslight came from his using those gaslights or gaslighting to manipulate her. And then eventually it was actually adopted into psychiatric, nomenclature as something people do to manipulate your sense of reality, whether, I think consciously or unconsciously. And I believe not just your sense of reality, but, your emotions, your feelings, your sense of self.
I wonder, the person who's being gaslit, what are some feelings that arise when they're being gaslit? And is it possible to recognize when you're being manipulated in that way?
Okay. So some of the feelings that arise is, and I'll try to use some examples, is that there's something wrong with you, that you in fact are crazy, a sense of just self-doubt, that you're lesser than, that there's something wrong with your feelings. So it can really range from just doubting yourself, constantly doubting yourself, to really thinking something's wrong with you, to really thinking like, I must be crazy. This never happened. An example might be, let's say, in a marriage, okay? The wife makes dinner, she's got dinner already, the kids are all sitting at dinner, and then the husband shows up, 3 hours late. And she says, we agreed we were going to eat dinner at 6 o'clock. I know I had dinner already and the kids were expecting you. And he says, I never said that. I never said I was going to be home for dinner. You get so disorganized. You don't keep things straight. I don't know. Maybe you should see a therapist. I never said I was going to be home for dinner at 6 o'clock. You know what? I said I had to work late. And then she starts to doubt, even though part of her knows he said he was going to be home for dinner at 6. She starts to doubt, is it that I'm just too disorganized? Maybe he never said he was going to be home at 6. And when these kinds of things occur over and over and over, you start to really wonder, well, there must just be something wrong with me. Or in a mother-daughter relationship, it can be things like doubting your own feelings. So let's say you're an adult and you have a brother, and your brother gets a new car, and you're happy for him, and you say to your mother, oh, Joe got a new car. It's really nice. He needed a new car. And mom turns to you and says, are you jealous? Are you jealous that Joe got a new car? And because she's your mother, you take what she says seriously. You start to doubt your own feeling, like, am I jealous? I thought I was happy for him, but maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm really not a good sister who doesn't have Joe's interest at heart. And when you get those kind of backhanded comments all the time that really question your intentions, that's a subtle way of gaslighting your character and who you are.
As an example, if a mother is maybe asking her daughter the same question over and over on multiple occasions and not really acting like she had listened, or maybe she wasn't actually listening. Is that gaslighting, where you feel like you're losing your mind a little bit because you feel like you've had that same conversation over and over again?
Hmm. Well, it certainly could have the same effect. Part of that is, it could be just, I really don't pay attention to you. And it could have the same impact of gaslighting. And then if the daughter says, this is what I've seen in my practice, Mom, I already told you that, we're having Thanksgiving dinner at 6, or I told you I'm not applying for a new job right now. Oh, you're so sensitive. If it depends on the reaction,
Hmm.
you're just so sensitive. I don't know why I have to act this way. Or, I never asked you that before. It kind of depends what the interaction leads to. Instead of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry," sometimes I just space out, which somebody who doesn't have those traits, because Cassie, a key feature of narcissism is because they have such a lack of self-esteem inside, they cannot tolerate any criticism because it's such a blow to their sense of self.
Hmm.
So rather than being able to say, "Oh, such a space candidate today," it's like, "There's nothing wrong with me. It's your problem." That would be a style of gaslighting. Part of it is, how do they react to you saying, "Hey, Mom, I already told you that a bunch of times."
Hmm. So I want to move to talk a little bit more about empathy. You mentioned that the common thread is the lack of empathy. In your book, you talk about two types of empathy. Can you talk about what those two types are?
Okay. So, we used to think that people who had narcissistic traits, personalities, had just no capacity for empathy at all. It was just missing. Now research shows us that empathy is more varied. So they can have a certain type of empathy. So the type of empathy that, you and I tend to think of is what we call emotional empathy. That's when you can really try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, sort of feel their feelings and be able to reflect that back to them. That is the type of empathy that is really difficult for someone with narcissism, where you really feel like they get you. And that's so important for relationships. Now we know that there's another type of empathy called cognitive empathy. And it's not that it's without use, cognitive empathy, but it's not what really fuels relationships. And cognitive empathy is when you can have sort of an intellectual understanding of a situation, of an interaction, of what somebody might be feeling. So maybe your daughter might come home from school and say, "I didn't make the, soccer team." And she looks down and, you could say, "Oh, that's too bad. That sucks. Yeah, I was really sad when I didn't make the soccer team." But it's sort of, you can try out again. And it sort of sounds like they're getting it. Sort of the words are there, but there's no heart in it. I call it talking the talk, but not walking the walk. And it's very confusing for daughters because they don't really feel understood. And parent might say, "Yeah, gosh, I tried out for the soccer team once. I didn't make it. Yeah, that was really upsetting to me." And so it's more intellectual. And that's what we call cognitive empathy. Or also what might happen is the parent might go overboard, and that can also happen where they get so upset, so overwrought that, they're charging in to the coach's office and crying, and "My daughter didn't make it." And it seems like empathy, but it's really not. It's all about the parent and their own, how it affected them. They're devastated. So that's the two different types that we're talking about here. And really what the daughter needs to be met where she is.
For the type of empathy where you were talking about the example of not making the team, where is kind of quiet, like, oh, yeah, I'm sorry you didn't make it. Does that come from some sort of like mirroring of like the mom doing what she thinks she should say? Or, where does that come from if they're not feeling it?
If they're not feeling it, I think generally we would say that people who struggle with narcissism, and honestly, Cassie, we don't fully understand how people become narcissistic. It's not the easiest population to study, but people come by narcissism honestly. These are people who, one part of it, in psychology, when it comes to people, it's kind of a combination of nature and nurture. So you take a certain person comes into the world with a certain wiring and temperament, and then you put them in a certain family environment with a certain type of set of experiences that are not the most nurturing. And they probably didn't get that themselves. They probably weren't raised in an environment where they were very warmly nurtured. And that's not going to lead them to grow up to somebody who's really going to have that ability to be nurturing to somebody else.
So in your book, you talk about negative thinking being a really common experience for the adult daughter. Can you talk about why it's such a common experience and what other struggles in that vein might the adult daughter be feeling?
Okay. So, what I see that daughters come in with in my practice is some of the main themes, in addition to what we call rumination or repetitive negative thinking, is, when they were growing up, they really felt invisible. Their needs were not met. They really had to learn to kind of take care of themselves and kind of blend into the wallpaper and kind of go into their own heads. They learned to judge their own thoughts and feelings because they weren't validated and accepted. They learned to stay in their own heads, and their feelings weren't validated and accepted. So they learned to kind of just constantly judge themselves and to squish their own feelings down, because expressing your feelings was really dangerous. Your feelings often could be seen as just a burden to your parent, or if you expressed your feelings, it turned into just a kind of a way for your parent to kind of take over the stage. Oh, you had a bad day. Well, you don't know what happened to me at the office today. So you just kind of pushed everything inside. And I think, many people struggle with repetitive negative thinking, with rumination. It's part of how we're wired. But I do find that women who grew up in these environments, it's just more intense. It's very much part of their thought processes. And this isn't a really, I think, an important thing is many women tell me, I mean, they're grown women and they still literally hear their mother's voice in their head criticizing them. It's like on a constant loop. One woman said, I hear her voice, the moment I wake up. I hear it all day long, commenting on what I'm doing and what's bad. Am I need to vacuum the living room? And why are you wearing those shoes with that outfit? That looks terrible. And because that's what they grew up with and they can't get rid of it. So that's kind of where that comes from.
It's almost like their mother's voice becomes their inner critic.
That's right. And they really can't distinguish her voice from their own voice.
Earning your continuing education hours doesn't have to be a painful experience. The right course can open your mind to new possibilities, increase your confidence, and hand you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training teams up with some of the brightest minds in mental health to provide cutting-edge, evidence-based training for practitioners. You can learn firsthand from experts like Stephen C. Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Robin Walzer, Kirk Strazel, and many others. Find your next training at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com. And along with negative thinking, you talk about 5 ways that your mind bullies you. Can you mention a little bit about each of those?
Yes, and these are things we've known about for a long time. Very common styles of what some people call them distorted thinking, unrealistic thoughts, unhelpful thoughts. Some of these, so I'll go through some of them. The overall category I like to say is catastrophic thinking, which is, something terrible is going to happen, turning a molehill into a mountain. The first one is like black and white thinking. Okay. So there's no shades of gray. So it could also be looked at as emotional reasoning. So let's say a daughter might say, whose mother is aging, she lives in Florida, and the daughter might say, if I don't move my mother near me, I'm a terrible daughter. It's black and white. There's nothing in between. Another one is minimizing or maximizing. And I think we all do this. We minimize our accomplishments or any good qualities we have, and we just maximize, blow out of proportion any flaw that we have or any mistake we made. So let's say a daughter does a podcast, right? And then she'll only think about the points that she forgot to make. And when she gets off and just ruminate about that and won't think about, the points that she did make that she feels good about. And so then the whole thing is a disaster. Emotional reasoning is another one, which is your feelings equal reality. So let's say the daughter is going to a party and walks in and says, "Oh, I feel so awkward. Therefore, so everyone thinks I'm weird, and I look so awkward, and I'm so awkward." That's just your feeling inside. Lots of people feel awkward at parties. That's not the reality of how other people perceive you. And another one is shoulds and oughts. I should do this. I should do this. I ought to do that. And not being able to differentiate, well, what do I want? What do I want to do? And just your whole life is a series of should. And so one thing that really helps is to be able to just label them. Because honestly, we can't change our thoughts. We really can. It would be great if we could, but our brains don't allow that so well. But just to be able to say, oh, there's that minimizing and contested. I just minimized again. Up, there's minimizing. It takes a big burden off of people just to be able to say, oh, there it is.
Sounds like it sort of takes the power out of the thought as well.
Takes the power.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
What role does shame play for adult daughters of narcissistic mothers, and why is that such a difficult emotion to face?
Yeah. Well, I would say I think it's one of the most painful emotions. And, shame and guilt, by the way, often get really mixed up. And guilt is, it's a useful emotion. It's the feeling like, you did something wrong that goes against your moral values, something that you can maybe make repairs for. We need guilt, or we'd all be sociopaths. Shame is the feeling that there's something wrong with you, that you're flawed in some deep way, you as a person. And when you grow up in a home with a parent in which you don't meet their needs, when you are not the person that they want you to be, when you're not seen, when you don't have a genuine, attachment, that is really a breeding ground for shame. A narcissistic parent needs you to be focused on them as opposed to you grow up and be a person. You can't do that, right? You can't meet your parents' needs all the time. And so you're going to fail at that. That's inevitable. And that is a recipe for shame. You take that into adulthood with you. And then when people grow up with that blanket of shame around them or inside them, often what women do is isolate, feel alone, feel like something's really wrong with them and feel different from other women. And that, has a big impact on how they go about their lives.
Another thing I found really fascinating in your book is you talk about how grief plays a role here.
Hmm.
I wondered if you could say more about that. And you mentioned also ambiguous loss, if you could talk about what that is too.
Grief can show up for women, whether their mother is alive or not alive. And I'm going to talk about grief, whether or not the mother is alive, because the kind of grief that I'm talking about is that women are grieving a relationship that they never had, that they will never have. And that's what women talk about a lot. And it's incredibly painful. And they have to mourn that. And women can feel such intense emotions about that, Cassie. Shame, anger, sadness, real despair about that they never had, that these are not fun feelings. Some women, even have fantasies. These feelings are so overwhelming. They have fantasies. They just want to get rid of these feelings. They even have fantasies of killing their mother. They would never do it, but it's so upsetting. They just cannot bear to be around it anymore because they feel like they just never got what they should have. And it's especially difficult around, holidays when friends are talking about their relationships with their mothers. And it really brings just a real heart sickness around. And then ambiguous loss is a concept that I discovered as I was writing the book that was developed by a psychologist named Pauline Boss, I believe in the 1970s. And she defines it as when someone is perceived, someone in your life is being perceived as being physically present, but psychologically absent. And I thought, wow, that is really what it feels like to have a narcissistic mother. And that's a different type of grieving. And so that is a really useful concept because you grieve feeling loved, seen, and cherished. And originally, Dr. Boss developed this during the Vietnam War to apply to families who had loved ones missing in action because they were, gone but not gone. And then she added it on to apply to people who were had Alzheimer's
Hmm.
uh, and other types of, relationships.
I think that's really important to put words to what people are feeling. Like that really makes a lot of sense for people who maybe can't find the language to say why they feel all this grief. So I thought that was really interesting and really a good point.
Yeah, and you're not alone in this. People feel this in all sorts of difficult situations.
For sure. And I want to move the rest of our conversation a little more solutions based for the adult daughter. And in your book, you use the metaphor slow to help the women navigate their emotional roller coasters. Can you talk about that a little bit more and why it can have a really positive impact?
Sure. And with slow, what I did is, I combined a lot of skills from different areas of psychology, things that we know are evidence-based, and tried to put them into one compact scale, one compact skill. I really believe no more than 4 letters for an acronym because I can't remember more than 4. So one, the reason I call it slow is because if you can only remember one thing, remember slow. Remember slow down. Really, when we are feeling upset, agitated, when our nervous systems are revved up, nothing can be lost by going too slow. Where we always get ourselves into trouble is by doing things that are impulsive. And so just remember slow down. But let's break it down and why it's helpful. The S is slow down, really settle your nervous system. And you can do that in so many different ways. Slow breathing, being mindful, looking around, talking to yourself, identifying things with your 5 senses, moving your body, practicing some form of mindfulness. You can put together a toolbox of skills that works for you, but you really have to stop and slow down. L is for look inside and, identify, figure out what you're feeling. And what I wanted to add to this is I find it's really helpful for people to know about primary and secondary emotions. We have basic emotions that everybody has, they're universal: sadness, happiness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. But what really messes us up and gets us into trouble is our secondary emotions, is what we feel about our emotions. Feeling guilt, shame. So maybe you feel angry at your mother because she was really invalidating. And then you feel guilty that you feel angry. So instead of saying, I feel angry, it's a really natural human emotion. And then so you ruminate about it, and you think about it, and you think about it, and you think about it because of the guilt. That's what messes us up. Instead of just saying, I accept this emotion, I allow it to flow through me. That's where the O comes up. Accept that emotion, validate it, write it out. It's okay to have that emotion. It's understandable. You don't have to push it away. And people find it really helpful to learn, like, oh, when I feel guilty about it, there's this primary, secondary emotion that makes it worse. You know that intuitively. I think we all do, but putting a label on that really makes it a lot easier to handle. That when we feel guilty about what we feel or shame about what we feel, we fight it.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we fight it, the more it just like drags on. It drags on. Whereas we feel like, yeah, I feel this. I don't like, I'm not crazy about it, but I can handle it. And then it just dissipates.
Yeah, saves you the spiral of the thinking pattern.
Right. And then when we're talking to our friends and I'm like, oh, this happened and I feel this way, and blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We've all been there. And finally, W is there's that waiting, choosing a response with compassion towards yourself and maybe even compassion towards the other person. And, what do I want to do about this? And that could be something inside that other people can't even see. I'm just going to sit here and breathe, or, just handle my thoughts and feelings, or something other people can see, like I'm going to go for a walk, or whatever it might be. But that way you can, when you've done these previous 3 steps, however long they take, it could be a minute, it could be 3 days, to choose a response that isn't impulsive, that isn't going to get you into trouble, and that you feel good about.
I think those are really easy to remember with your acronym and really important. And one thing that seems very important in this work is rebuilding confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about how women may begin to build their confidence and find their core strengths again?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I recommend, in the book, there's, lists of your strengths, your values. An exercise I find really helpful is because no matter how unconfident we feel, everybody has something in their life or things in their lives that they've done that they feel good about. Even a little bit. I mean, it could be the smallest thing. I got a plant and it was dying and I nurtured it back to health. Thinking about that success. How did you do it? What does it say about you that you did that? Were there other resources in your life that helped you do that, people or things, and kind of unpacking that and starting to do that and understand what you've already done that's worked? That is a jumping off point to understand your strengths. And then really I starting to identify, going into the idea of values. What matters to you? What's important? And I don't mean values like right and wrong values. I mean values like what lights you up? What gives your life purpose and meaning. How do you want to show up in the world? Maybe it's being a kind person, being a good friend, being, a good caretaker of the environment. And how do you take one of those values and choose an action that you can do, even a little tiny bit, to execute that will help build your confidence? And why that's important is because the brain only learns by doing. And what's a small step that you can take?
I appreciate that the entry to that seems very simple, like focusing on accomplishments you've already made or just what's important to you. So I appreciate that. That seems easy to start, like a small step.
A small step. Really, I'm a big believer in small steps.
Well, I think that's a good place to end and ask just if you have any final thoughts for our listeners.
Yeah, the thing I always like to share with listeners, Cassie, I like to share with daughters of narcissistic mothers, especially, or, really anyone who struggled with a narcissist in your life, is that you are not alone, even though you feel alone. And so I just really urge you to I think education is the most important thing to start off with. Knowledge is power. That's why I'm so grateful for podcasts like this. And the more the better you'll start to feel, and maybe even have the courage to find someone that you really trust to share your parts of your story with, because then you'll start to feel understood. And that is really the gateway to starting to change your life.
This has been such a great conversation. I think a lot of women are going to find their emotions validated through your work. A lot of people will find help. And I just really appreciate your time you took to talk with me.
Well, thank you, Cassie. I so appreciate the opportunity.
Written by a psychologist and expert in narcissism, Adult Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers offers proven effective strategies drawn from cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy to help you reduce anxiety, build confidence, overcome self-criticism, and live the life you deserve. You'll also find tons of practical tips to help you build healthy, trusting relationships, stop apologizing for the failures of others, and start trusting your own good judgment. If you were raised by a narcissistic mother and are struggling with the lingering effects of a toxic upbringing, this is the roadmap you'll need to heal the past and thrive in the present and future. Visit our website, www.newharbinger.com, and use coupon code PODCAST25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. Help your clients achieve lasting emotional balance with the DBT Skills Mega Bundle from New Harbinger Publications. This essential collection offers everything you need to effectively deliver dialectical behavior therapy in your practice, including a set of 8 exclusive microskills videos to help improve client motivation in treatment. Visit newharbinger.com for more information. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.